I remember the exact moment the air changed in the room, that specific shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when a decision is made public, and the collective judgment of a group settles onto a single pair of shoulders. It was a Tuesday morning. The light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room was that particular shade of gray that suggests rain but never delivers it. And I was sitting at the far end of the mahogany table, exactly where I expected to be, which was nowhere near the center of power. I am 45 years old, and in the ecosystem of high-stakes corporate restructuring, that age often carries a specific weight, a subtle implication that you are either entrenched and untouchable or outdated and overlooked. I had spent the last decade building a reputation as a specialist who could walk into failing divisions and stabilize them without firing half the staff, an approach that garnered respect in quiet corners but rarely applause in the boardroom. Then Elias Thorne walked in. Elias is not just a colleague. He is the CEO, the majority shareholder, and the man who had once been my partner in a life that existed before the mergers and the acquisitions and the careful distancing we had maintained for the last 3 years. When he placed the folder in front of me, the leather-bound cover smooth and heavy under my fingertips, the silence in the room was not respectful. It was predatory. I could feel the eyes of the vice presidents, the junior partners, the people who had whispered about my departure from the executive team years ago, all of them waiting for me to flinch. He offered me the position of Chief Restructuring Officer for the failing Pacific Division, a role that had chewed up 3 men in the last 5 years and spat them out with ruined reputations. He didn't look at me with pity, or at least I told myself he didn't. He looked at me with that steady, unreadable focus that had always been his signature. The kind of look that made you feel like you were the only variable in a complex equation that he was trying to solve. I accepted the job because I needed the work, yes, but also because I needed to know if the man who had walked away from our personal relationship could still see the professional worth in me without the cloud of our history obscuring his vision. But as I signed the contract, pen moving across the paper with a scratch that sounded too loud in the quiet room, I heard the shift in someone's posture behind me, a slight exhale that sounded like dismissal. They thought I was a charity case. They thought Elias was giving me a lifeline because he felt guilty about how things ended between us, or perhaps because he thought I couldn't survive on my own anymore. That was the misunderstanding that would define the next 6 months of my life, not the work itself, but the narrative that surrounded it, the invisible script everyone else was reading from while I was trying to write my own. I didn't correct them. I didn't stand up and declare my qualifications or list the successes I had garnered in the shadows of smaller firms. I simply closed the folder, stood up, and walked out of the room with my spine straight, knowing that in this environment, dignity is not given, it is constructed through action. I went back to my temporary office, a space that felt too small for the scope of what I was about to undertake, and I sat down to look at the data. The Pacific Division was bleeding money, not because of market conditions, but because of structural inefficiencies that anyone with a keen eye could see, yet everyone had chosen to ignore because fixing them required making uncomfortable choices. I opened the files, and I began to work, letting the numbers speak to me because numbers don't lie, people do. The first week was a study in isolation. I moved through the halls of the headquarters like a ghost, present but unseen, observing the dynamics of the team I was now supposed to lead. There were whispers, of course. There are always whispers in a company this size, especially when a woman of my age is placed in a role typically reserved for aggressive younger men with MBAs from Ivy League schools who talk more than they listen. I heard snippets of conversations in the break room, the way voices would lower when I approached the elevator, the polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes of the senior managers. They were waiting for me to fail. It wasn't personal, not really, it was structural. I represented a disruption to the hierarchy, a reminder that merit sometimes overrides tenure, and that is a threatening concept to people who have climbed the ladder by waiting their turn. Elias kept his distance. We had agreed on that professionally, a boundary we had set when I accepted the offer. No special treatment, no private meetings, no acknowledgement of the years we had spent building a life together before the pressures of his ascent to the billionaire status had fractured us. I saw him in the hallway sometimes, surrounded by his security and his aides, a king in his own castle, and he would nod, a brief, professional acknowledgement that felt like a door closing. I told myself I preferred it this way. I told myself that mixing our history with this high-stakes environment would only validate the rumors that I was there because of him, not because of what I could do. But there were moments, late at night when the office was empty and the city lights of Seattle were blinking below like a circuit board of human ambition, where I would look at the email chain from him regarding the budget approval and wonder if there was more in the subtext than the text. He approved everything I asked for, no questions, no pushback, which was unusual for a CEO known for his scrutinizing eye on capital expenditure. Was it trust, or was it a setup? If he gave me enough rope, was he waiting to see if I would hang myself with it, proving the board right that I was too soft, too emotional, too connected to the past to make the hard cuts required? I couldn't decide, and that uncertainty was a weight I carried in my chest, heavier than the workload. I needed to know the truth, not just about the company, but about us, because I couldn't fix the Pacific Division if I was constantly looking over my shoulder wondering if the foundation beneath me was solid or if it was made of glass. So I adopted a strategy of radical transparency. I opened my books to the team. I invited the skeptics into the strategy sessions. I asked for their input on the inefficiencies, not to defer to them, but to show them that I saw what they saw and that I had a plan to fix it that didn't involve burning the house down. It was a risky move. In this industry, vulnerability is often mistaken for weakness, but I knew that if I could win over the lieutenants, the generals would have no choice but to follow. I started with Mark, the head of logistics, a man who had been with the company for 20 years and who had looked at me with open disdain on my first day. I asked him to walk me through the supply chain bottlenecks. I didn't sit behind my desk. I stood next to him at the whiteboard, marker in hand, asking questions that showed I understood the granularity of his work. I saw the moment his defense lowered, the slight relaxation of his shoulders when he realized I wasn't there to blame him for the delays, but to understand them. That was the first crack in the wall. But outside of the office, the narrative was hardening. I went to an industry gala 2 weeks into the job, an event where the elite of the tech and logistics world gather to pat each other on the back and exchange business cards that cost more than my first car. I was standing near the bar, holding a sparkling water, when I heard 2 women from a competitor firm talking near the restroom. They didn't see me behind the pillar. One of them said, "Did you hear Thorne gave the restructuring job to his ex?" The other laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, and said, "Obviously. She's 45, darling. She's not getting hired for her mind anymore. She's getting hired for her history. It's a consolation prize. She'll be out by Christmas." I stood there for a moment, the cold glass of the water pressing into my palm. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, that primal flush of humiliation that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with being perceived as less than. I wanted to turn around and correct them. I wanted to list my credentials, my success rates, the fact that Elias and I hadn't spoken personally in 3 years. But I didn't. I turned and walked away. Vengeance is not a strategy. Clarity is. If they thought I was a pity hire, I would have to be so undeniably effective that the only explanation left would be competence. But the seed of doubt had been planted, not just by them, but by the way Elias had been acting. There was a protectiveness in his distance that felt intentional. He was shielding me from the board's scrutiny, I realized, by keeping me at arm's length publicly. If he associated too closely with me, the board would claim conflict of interest. If he ignored me, they would claim indifference. He was walking a tightrope, and I was the weight on the line. I needed to know if he was walking it for me or for the company. The escalation began in the 2nd month. The restructuring plan was moving forward. We had identified 30% of the overhead that could be eliminated without layoffs, simply by renegotiating vendor contracts and streamlining the software infrastructure. It was good work, it was smart work, but the board was getting impatient. They wanted blood. They wanted layoffs. They wanted the kind of drastic measures that make headlines and boost stock prices temporarily while destroying company culture permanently. I received a summons to the main boardroom, not from Elias, but from the chairman, a man named Sterling who had never liked me. He sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 other members I didn't recognize, and there was no Elias. That was the first sign. When Elias is involved in a restructuring of this magnitude, he is present. His absence was a message. Sterling slid a document across the table. It was a performance review, but it wasn't mine. It was a projection. It showed that based on current trajectories, my plan would save the company money in the long term, but would miss the quarterly targets by a significant margin. They were giving me an ultimatum. Implement the layoffs by Friday or resign. I looked at the document, then at Sterling. I asked where Elias was. Sterling smiled, a thin expression that didn't involve his eyes. He said Elias is recused from this decision due to potential conflict of interest regarding your personnel file. Conflict of interest. The words hung in the air like smoke. They were using our past against me. They were implying that Elias was too soft on me, that he couldn't be objective, and therefore they were stepping in to do what he wouldn't. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. This wasn't just about the company. This was a power play. They were trying to force Elias' hand by threatening me. If I resigned, it would look like I couldn't handle the pressure. If I fired the people, I would betray my own philosophy and become the kind of executive I despised. But there was something else. Why was Elias recused? He never recuses himself from major divisional decisions. He is the CEO. For him to step back, he had to agree to it. Did he agree to this to protect his position? Or was he forced? I looked at Sterling and I told him I needed 24 hours to review the data. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I took the paper and I walked out. I went straight to my office and I locked the door. I sat there for an hour, staring at the wall, letting the panic rise and then recede. Panic is useless. Information is power. I needed to find out what Elias knew. I needed to see the emails. I had access to the server logs, not to his private files, but to the communication trails regarding the board meetings. I started digging. It wasn't hacking, it was auditing. I was the chief restructuring officer. I had clearance to view the decision trees for the Pacific Division. I found the thread. It was from 3 days ago, an email from Sterling to Elias. It was brief. It said, "We need to discuss the Samantha situation. Her proximity to you is compromising the board's confidence. We need a demonstration of impartiality. If you don't distance yourself, we will initiate a vote of no confidence in your leadership regarding this division." So that was it. They weren't attacking me because I was failing. They were attacking me to weaken him. And Elias had chosen to step back rather than fight them openly, perhaps because he knew a fight would destabilize the stock price, perhaps because he thought I could handle the pressure on my own. But he hadn't told me. He had let me walk into that room alone. He had let them use our history as a weapon without giving me the shield of his support. I felt a betrayal sharp enough to take my breath away. It wasn't that he didn't believe in me. It was that he hadn't warned me. He had let me believe this was purely about my performance when it was actually about his politics. I spent the night at the office. I didn't go home. I ordered food I didn't eat. I looked at the restructuring plan again. I looked at the names of the people we were supposed to fire. I thought about Mark in logistics, who had finally started smiling at me. I thought about the team who had stayed late to help me crunch the numbers. If I fired them to save my job, I would be proving the women at the gala right. I would be the charity case who couldn't do the hard thing. If I resigned, I would be letting the board win, and I would be leaving Elias to deal with the fallout alone. There was a third option, but it required a risk that terrified me. It required me to trust that the man who had stepped back was actually doing it to give me the space to prove them wrong, not because he was sacrificing me. I had to find evidence of his intent. I needed to know if he was protecting me or protecting himself. I went through the archived meeting minutes from the last year. I looked for patterns. I looked for times when Elias had overridden the board on personnel decisions. I found one, 6 months ago. He had fought to keep a director who was underperforming because that director had unique institutional knowledge. Elias values loyalty and long-term vision over short-term gains. That was his pattern. So why was he letting them push me? Unless he knew I didn't need his help. Unless he knew that if he stepped in, it would validate their claim of conflict. He was giving me the arena to fight my own battle. It was a terrible, beautiful, frustrating strategy. He was betting on me when I didn't even know I was in the ring. I realized then that my anger was misplaced. I was angry at his silence, but his silence was the only way I could have voice. If he spoke for me, I would never be heard. But I couldn't do this without knowing for sure. I needed to confront him, not as an employee to a CEO, but as Samantha to Elias. I needed the truth, not the corporate script. The climax happened on Thursday evening, the day before the deadline Sterling had given me. I knew Elias would be in his office late. He always worked through the night when the stock was volatile. I took the elevator to the top floor, the private executive level where the air is thinner and the carpets are thicker. The receptionist was gone. The lights were dimmed. I walked down the hallway to his door. It was ajar. I could see him inside, standing by the window, looking out at the rain that had finally started to fall, streaking the glass like tears. I knocked on the frame. He turned. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. The masks we wear in the boardroom were gone. He was just a man in a shirt sleeves, tie loosened, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in 3 years. It was worry. I walked in and closed the door. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the room, holding the tablet with the board's ultimatum. I told him I knew about the email. I told him I knew about the recusal. I told him I knew they were using me to get to him. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. I wasn't accusing him. I was asking him. I asked him why he didn't tell me. Why he let me walk into Sterling's office without knowing the stakes were about his power, not just my job. He walked towards me slowly, like he was approaching a skittish animal. He stopped a few feet away. He said, because if I told you, you would have fought them for me, and I couldn't ask you to do that. I couldn't ask you to sacrifice your integrity to save my seat. I looked at him. I saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't hiding because he didn't care. He was hiding because he cared too much. He knew that if he defended me publicly, the board would claim I was his puppet. He needed me to be independent. He needed me to be the one who said no to Sterling, not him. He was giving me the authority to save the division, and in doing so, save him. But he couldn't tell me that, because if I knew I was saving him, I might hesitate. I had to believe I was saving the company. I had to believe I was saving myself. It was a manipulation, yes, but it was a benevolent one. It was a trust fall where he was the one letting go first. I felt the anger dissolve, replaced by a profound sadness for the complexity of our positions. We were two people who loved each other enough to let go, but now we had the chance to hold on. I told him I wasn't going to fire the staff. I told him I was going to present the long-term plan to the full shareholders meeting, bypassing the board if I had to. I told him it would be risky. It could fail. He looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, he smiled. Not the CEO smile, the real one, the one that used to make me feel like I was the only person in the world. He said, I know you won't fail. I said, you can't say that. You're recused. He stepped closer. He said, I'm not speaking as the CEO. I'm speaking as the man who knows you. I know what you can do. I know you've already solved the vendor contract issue with the Asian suppliers. I know you found the loophole in the software licensing that saves us $4 million a year. I know you've done the work. The board doesn't see it because they're looking at the spreadsheet. I see you. The air between us changed. It wasn't charged with tension anymore. It was charged with recognition. He saw me. Not the ex-wife, not the charity case, not the employee. He saw me. The woman who solves problems. The woman who cares about people. The woman who chooses clarity over anger. I realized then that the mockery, the whispers, the doubt from the board, none of it mattered. What mattered was that he had given me the job not because he wanted me close, but because he knew I was the only one who could fix it. He had bet his reputation on my competence, and I had spent weeks thinking he was betting against me. The misunderstanding shattered. It didn't break with a shout. It broke with a silence that was finally honest. I put the tablet down on his desk. I told him I needed his vote at the shareholder meeting. He said, you'll have it. I said, and I need you to stand next to me when I present. He hesitated. I told him, let them talk. Let them say it's a conflict. If we win, the results speak louder than the rumors. If we lose together. But I won't lose. He nodded. He reached out and touched my hand. His skin was warm. It was the first time we had touched in years. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a pact. A reaffirmation of trust. We stood there for a long time, listening to the rain against the window, two partners realigning their trajectories. The fear was gone, the guard was down. I wasn't the woman everyone mocked anymore. I was the woman who had the CEO's backing, not because of love, but because of merit. And the love was there, waiting in the wings, no longer a liability, but a strength. The falling action was the week that followed. The shareholder meeting was held in the main auditorium, a space that smelled of polished wood and anxiety. I stood at the podium. Elia stood to my right, slightly behind me, a visual signal of support without overshadowing my voice. The board members sat in the front row, Sterling looking particularly sour. I didn't use a script. I spoke from the data, but I spoke from the heart. I talked about the company not as a machine, but as an organism. I explained that cutting the staff would kill the immune system of the organization, leaving it vulnerable to future infections. I showed the projections. I showed the $4 million saved from the licensing loophole. I showed the vendor contracts I had renegotiated. I showed the path to profitability that didn't require blood. I could feel the room shifting. People lean in when you offer them hope instead of fear. I saw the analysts typing on their laptops. I saw the board members exchanging glances. Sterling tried to interrupt. He tried to raise the point about the quarterly targets, but Elias stood up. He didn't speak, he just looked at Sterling. The weight of his presence was enough. Sterling sat back down. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then, applause, not polite applause, real applause from the shareholders, from the staff who were watching via live stream. I looked at Elias. He was looking at me with pride, not the pride of a boss for an employee, the pride of a partner. We walked out of the room together. The hallway was crowded with people wanting to shake my hand, wanting to congratulate me. I accepted the greetings gracefully, but I kept my focus on the exit. I needed air. I needed a moment to process the shift in gravity. We went to the rooftop garden, a secluded space where the wind was clean and the city was quiet. I leaned against the railing. I felt exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. The kind that comes after a marathon you know you finished. Elias stood next to me. He didn't say anything for a while. He just let me be. That was another thing I loved about him. He knew when to speak and when to just exist alongside you. Finally, he said, "You changed the company." I said, "We changed the company." He shook his head. "No, I gave the job, you did the work. You changed the culture. You made them see that efficiency doesn't have to mean cruelty." I looked at him. I said, "Why did you really hire me? Was it because I was the best, or was it because you wanted to fix us?" He turned to face me. He said, "I hired you because you were the best, but I hoped it would fix us. I didn't want to use work to fix a relationship. I know that's unhealthy, but I couldn't let you go, not when I knew what you were capable of. I needed you here, not just for me. For you, you were wasting your talent at the smaller firms. You were hiding. I wanted you to come home." The word home hung in the air. It wasn't a place. It was a state of being. It was where we were when we were honest. I realized then that the mockery, the job, the board, it was all just noise. The signal was us. We had spent 3 years thinking that love and work couldn't mix, that professionalism required distance. But we were wrong. Professionalism requires integrity, and integrity means acknowledging the truth. The truth was that we were better together. Not just romantically, but strategically. We balanced each other. He was the vision, I was the execution, he was the risk, I was the stability. I told him I was tired of being guarded. I told him I was tired of pretending I didn't care. He reached out and took my hand again. This time, he didn't let go. He said, "Me too." We stood there as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city. The company was saved, the stock was up, the board was silenced. But none of that mattered as much as the feeling of his hand in mine. It was a simple thing, a physical connection. But after months of digital communication and boardroom posturing, it felt like a revelation. We walked back inside together. We didn't hide. We didn't worry about the whispers. Let them whisper. Let them say what they wanted. We knew the truth, and the truth was enough. The ending was not a grand gesture. There was no public announcement of our reconciliation. There was no engagement ring flashed in the office. It was quieter than that. It was a return to normalcy, but a new kind of normal. We went back to work. The dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the outsider. I was a leader. Elias treated me with the same respect he treated the other executives, but there was a warmth in his eyes that only I could see. We had lunch together sometimes in the cafeteria with the staff. We didn't sit at the executive table. We sat with the engineers, the logistics coordinators, the people who kept the company moving. It sent a message. It showed that leadership wasn't about isolation. It was about connection. The mockery stopped, not because I demanded it, but because the results spoke for themselves. The Pacific Division was profitable within 6 months. The staff retention rate was the highest in the company. People stopped talking about who I slept with and started asking me for advice on how to manage teams. I became a mentor. I took young women under my wing, women who were told they were too old, too soft, too emotional. I told them what I had learned. I told them that clarity is stronger than anger. I told them that truth is the only strategy that works in the long run. I told them that love is not a weakness in business. It is the foundation of trust, and without trust, you have nothing. Elias and I took it slow. We didn't rush back into the relationship we had before. We built a new one that acknowledged the scars, one that acknowledged the power dynamics. We set boundaries. We had rules. We made sure that work was work and home was home, but we allowed the values of one to inform the other. We learned to communicate without fear. When there was a misunderstanding, we addressed it immediately. We didn't let it fester. We didn't let the board or the staff or the rumors dictate our narrative. We wrote our own story. One evening, months later, we were at his house, not the penthouse, but the cabin we used to go to on weekends, the one we had sold during the separation and he had bought back without telling me. He took me there for dinner. It was simple. Pasta, wine, the fire was lit. We sat on the couch. He handed me a glass. He said, "I bought this back the week I hired you. I wanted to make sure there was a place to come back to, if you wanted." I looked at him. I saw the vulnerability there. The billionaire who could buy anything was afraid I wouldn't want to come back. I took the glass. I said, "I never left." "Not really. I was just waiting for you to see me." He said, "I see you." "I always saw you." I leaned my head on his shoulder. It felt like coming home. It felt like resolution. The journey had been hard. The misunderstanding had cost us time. It had cost us peace. But it had also given us clarity. We knew what we were worth. We knew what we had to each other. The company was changed. I had changed. But the most important change was us. We were whole again, not because the problems were gone. Problems never go away. But because we had the tools to handle them. We had trust. We had truth. We had love. I looked out the window at the dark woods, the silence of the nature surrounding us. I thought about the women in the break room. I thought about Sterling. I thought about the fear I had felt in that boardroom. It seemed so far away now, like a dream. I realized that the job wasn't the victory. The victory was the integrity. The victory was choosing not to become bitter. The victory was choosing to believe in the best version of the person I loved, even when the evidence was obscured. And he had chosen to believe in me, even when the board told him not to. We had saved each other. Not by fighting the world, but by standing firm in who we were. I took a sip of the wine. It was warm. It tasted like earth and grapes and time. I looked at Elias. He was watching the fire. He looked peaceful. I reached out and took his hand. He squeezed back. We didn't need to say anything. The story was told. The resolution was reached. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a challenge to be survived. It looked like a promise to be kept. I closed my eyes and I listened to the crackle of the fire. I listened to his breathing. I listened to the silence that was no longer heavy, but light. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of love restored. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter what happened next, no matter what the market did, no matter what the board decided, we would be okay. Because we had the only asset that truly matters. We had each other. And we had the truth. And that was enough. It had to be. And it was. The journey from the boardroom to the cabin, from the mockery to the respect, from the misunderstanding to the clarity, it was all worth it. Every moment of doubt, every sleepless night, every tear shed in the office bathroom, it all led to this. To this quiet moment of connection, to this restoration of trust. I am 45 years old. I am the chief restructuring officer. I am the woman who changed the company. But mostly, I am the woman who chose love over fear. And that is the title I wear with the most pride. The night deepened. The fire burned low. We sat together, two silhouettes against the warmth, watching the embers glow. There was no need for more words. The story was complete. The resolution was absolute. And the heart, finally, was full. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 years. It escaped into the warm air of the room, invisible and light. Elias shifted, pulling a blanket over our legs. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the firelight. He asked if I was cold. I said no. I said I was exactly where I needed to be. He smiled. It was the same smile from the office, but softer now. Private. He said, good, because I'm not letting you go again. I said, you don't have to. We sat in the silence, letting the warmth seep into our bones. The outside world continued to turn. The stock market would open in the morning. The emails would pile up. The challenges would arise, but none of it could touch this. None of it could break this. We had built something stronger than the company. We had built a partnership. And that was the real restructuring. That was the real success. I closed my eyes again, letting the feeling of safety wash over me. It was a rare thing, a precious thing, and I held it tight. I held it like the most valuable asset on the balance sheet, because it was everything. And as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, I knew that the story wasn't just about a job. It wasn't just about a company. It was about two people finding their way back to each other through the noise, through the doubt, through the fear, and finding that the truth was waiting for them all along, waiting to be claimed, waiting to be lived. And we had claimed it, we were living it, and it was beautiful. The end of the struggle was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. One written in trust, one written in love, one written in the quiet confidence of knowing that you are seen, truly seen, and that is the greatest victory of all. I opened my eyes one last time before sleep took me. I looked at Elias. He was asleep now, his head tilted back, his hand still holding mine. I squeezed it gently. He didn't wake. He didn't need to. He knew I was there. I knew he was there. That was enough. The fire burned down to embers. The room grew dark. But we were not afraid of the dark. We had our own light, and it was enough. It was always enough.